Within e-card metagame, this is the rogue deck, in my opinion at least. Doomapus, or Octodoom, or Houndoom, whatever you want to call it, it's Houndoom and Octillery. Why is it such a good rogue combination? Well, for starters, just typing. Fire is gonna hit Scizor and all of those annoying grass decks. For weakness, and most of the time an Oko, because you hit that magical number of 60 with Houndoom's burn-up attack. Likewise, Octillery is going to hit all of those fire types for weakness that exist within the metagame to hit all of the grass types for weakness. They're both Stage 1 cards, so their setup is a tad simpler than all of these other Stage 2 decks. They don't really require any support, which streamlines that process even more, and they both do very annoying things. While Houndoom is setting up for a burn-up attack on turn 3, you can use Smokescreen for 1 energy in the process. It's going to deal 10 damage, and on your opponent's next turn, when they try to attack you, they have to flip a coin first, and if tails, that attack fails, it does nothing. And as I said earlier, when you do have a fully powered burn-up, you're going to Oko pretty much any steel or grass type in format. But because of the coin flip, you're only going to have to discard all of those fire energy about 50% of the time. Octillery also has Smokescreen with the same effect, where if the defending Pokemon tries to attack you next turn, they have to flip a coin. If tails, nothing happens. This time it costs 3 energy though, which is a bit much, and it's dealing 40 damage, which is not going to be knocking out your Charizards or Typhlosion, but it is going to Oko, Rapidash, Ninetales, Houndoom, Flareon, pretty much all of the other Stage 1 fire types that you're going to see in e-card. One flaw in the Smokescreen strategy is that your opponent can switch out of it. As long as the defending Pokemon changes, then the effect of Smokescreen is no longer in effect. However, Octillery tries to correct for that with its Suction Cups Pokebody. As long as Octillery is your active Pokemon, when the defending Pokemon retreats, they discard all energy attached to them, no matter what the retreat cost is. Even if they're free retreating to the bench, all the energy's gone. As you've probably noticed from the deck list preceding this one, not a lot of e-card decks run a ton of switch options. You know, most decks will run a couple copies of Switch, maybe a couple copies of Warp Energy. Suction Cups is almost like this weird trapping mechanism that puts a weird pressure on your opponent that they're not really used to seeing, and isn't really that big of a deal within e-card unless you build the strategy of your deck around it, which is pretty much what this rogue does. What do I mean by that? Well, let's just look at the deck list and find out. Let's dig into Houndoom Octillery. I'm a fan of simple strategies and archetypes, which is probably one of the reasons I enjoy this deck so much. You don't have to think too hard about it. You can definitely win some games with it, but that's not the focus. It's more on having fun than crafting the perfect damage calculation to overwhelm your opponent. Like, let's get all of that out of here. Full playset of Remoraid. It is surprisingly nice early game because it's got 50 HP for a basic. A little surprising for a Remoraid, but for 1 water you're able to splatter and just snipe for 10. Sometimes it matters, most of the time it doesn't. But if you are able to hit a Cyndaquil or a Charmander early game just to get a little bit of chip damage on there, it does make KOs in the mid to late game a little bit easier. An accompanying playset of Octillery, we've already talked about its merits in the intro. The biggest downside I really have with Octillery is it has a retreat cost of 2 itself, and no attacks other than the 3 energy Smokescreen, so sometimes it gets stranded in the active and you just kind of have to roll with it. A full playset of Houndour. Now there are 4 different Houndours to choose from in e-card. I just went for 4 of the same, the 50 HP dark type that can attack for 1 energy. I find that just to be the all-around best, since it's not going to be seeing too much action. You're going to be evolving up into Houndoom as quickly as possible because you can attack for 1 colorless energy, so why not get that extra HP boost? And potentially prevent damage next turn with a Smokescreen. Really make those fossil Magmars proud by just Smokescreening all over the place, annoying your opponent. I wanted to include a couple more basic Pokemon in this deck just to prevent more mulligans, and so I went with a card that I feel is very underrated that could fit into any deck, and that's Farfetch'd. It's got 50 HP, has a gusting attack for 1 colorless energy, which could play into an effective Octillery drop on the next turn. But more often than not, you're going to be using Leak Rush, in which you flip a coin until you get tails and you deal 10 damage for each head. Always a fun option to just include a card that can deal near infinite damage for one colorless energy. That Farfetch'd is so underrated, and I forgot to include it in any of my E-card underrated videos, so it's getting some spotlight here in Doompuss. Some familiar staples popping up here for that early game setup. Full playset of Pokemon Fan Club, so you can pull the basics out of your deck, get them onto your bench, and then a full playset of Professor Elm's training method, so you can pull out the evolution cards that you're going to be stacking on top of them. I feel like it's always good to try to get the Houndoom into play first, since it's the more efficient attacker. Octillery is more of a mid to late game disruption card when your opponent has stacked a ton of energy onto their active Pokemon, and Octillery puts them in a position of, yeah, you're just going to stay in the active position until I KO you, because if you want to retreat, you're losing all of this energy progress you've already invested. One copy of Town Volunteers just to recycle some of those basic Pokemon and even evolution cards every now and then that you need for that setup loop. So if you're just needing another Houndoom in play, you really need something that can attack for 1 energy and still, you know, put some pressure on your opponent. You can Town Volunteers to shuffle them back into your deck and hopefully draw them out with cards like Professor Oak's Research or Underground Expedition. That's what they're in there for. And since this is a rogue deck, you know we're going to be including a full playset of energy removal too. Not only are you adding pressure to your opponent for losing energy against an Octillery just by retreating to the bench, but you're also just going to knock some of those energies off yourself. If they start trying to set up another big Pokemon on the bench with a bunch of energy, just start knocking some of those off, or use Pokemon Reversal to yank them up into the active position and basically trap them there, because your opponent's already invested some energy at that point. Do they really want to lose them just by retreating back? Now, all of that does revolve around coin flips, since a lot of the added disruption is based around great value energy removal and Kmart brand Gust. The full playset of Cyclone Energy is going to be a guaranteed Gust every turn, but one that your opponent gets to choose. Most of the time it's not going to matter though, since you do have options for working around whatever their choice is. The rest of the deck's just going to be filled out by 5 water energy and 10 fire energy. Just look how cozy clean this lineup is. The deck knows what it wants to do. The methods to establish that strategy are straightforward and simple, and you got everything you need right here in this very tight deck list. Which also leaves plenty of room for your one-off techs or anything else you might want to include in this deck. It's very simple to just substitute in one of those cards for one of the staples without really disrupting the flow or the power of this deck at all. 1 energy Smokescreen early game is enough to stall out long enough to get at least 1 Octillery set up on the bench. If you're playing against something that Octillery is weak to, you can just set up another Houndoom and grab a Farfetch'd as an alternative attacker. Obviously, the real fun from this deck just comes from using a form of Smokescreen turn after turn after turn, stalling your opponent out 50% of the time. In the meantime, hitting them with energy removals and gusts to just mess with their strategy, and periodically hitting for bigger chunks of damage in the mid to late game. But how does the deck fare against anything that isn't Grass, Fire, or Scizor? Pretty decently most of the time, though. It can get into some really difficult spots against decks that have built-in switching mechanics like Gengar that just straight up remove one of your disruption sources. Special condition decks like Beedrill especially can really put the pressure on Houndoom Octillery as well, just because this deck list doesn't run any switching options itself. And Smokescreen unfortunately can't prevent Venom Spray because it's a Poke Power and not an attack. If this type of matchup is a concern, then putting in a few copies of Warp Point and or Switch is probably a good idea. Full Heal is another option that some decks opt for. To really experience this deck, you kind of have to play it within the metagame. It's not enough to just talk about how good it could be and the reasons why, so I encourage you to give it a shot on TCG1 or in person if anyone's actually playing e-cardboard, and let me know what the results are. Let me know your opinions on running this deck. Even if you're not personally playtesting this deck, still chuck those opinions and comments down in the comment section. I want to know what you think about this deck list. I want to know what you think about e-card as a whole so far, and I want to know what ideas you want to see tested on this channel. What types of content do you want to see up next? I thank you so much for watching. If you want to hit me up on social media, those links are in the video description. and I will see you next video.